When I saw my husband standing by the pool, holding the letter in his hands, my breath caught in my throat, not because I feared what he might read, but because I already knew what it would do to him. That letter, folded and unfolded too many times, had been sitting in my drawer for weeks, maybe months. I told myself I'd thrown it away. I told myself I'd burned it. But here it was, damp from the night air, trembling slightly in his grip. I froze in the doorway, unable to speak, as he scanned the words I had tried so hard to keep from him. His face didn't change all at once. It shifted piece by piece, confusion first, then something sharper, then that hollow kind of stillness that tells you the ground is about to open. My heart raced, every beat loud enough to drown out the quiet sound of the pool's water lapping in the breeze. I wanted to snatch it from his hands, tear it apart, scatter it like leaves. But instead, I stood there, biting the inside of my cheek, tasting that familiar sting of blood I always felt when I was cornered. And as I stood there, I realized this moment wasn't just about that letter. It wasn't even about what it said. It was about what it meant. About what had already been set in motion long before ink touched paper. My husband's hands shook as he turned the page, and I knew he was seconds away from reading the line, the one sentence that would change everything. The one I wrote on a night when I wasn't thinking about consequences, or marriage, or what would happen when the truth finally surfaced. The page fluttered in his grip as he read on, and I could see his chest rising and falling faster. I knew he could hear my breath, and I knew I couldn't stop this. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that split my life into two pieces, the one I used to have, and the one I can't escape now. And before I tell you what happened, before I let you into the secret I've been carrying in every step, I need you to understand how it began. The first time I suggested that he move in with us, it felt like nothing more than an act of kindness. I said it lightly, over coffee one morning, after another night when my husband's father had slept alone in that too big, too empty house. It would only be for a little while, I said, the words sliding out before I even thought them through. My husband barely looked up from his phone when he agreed. It seemed logical, even compassionate. His mother had died only weeks before, and the man was adrift in his grief, caught between routines that no longer made sense and silences that pressed against his walls. I thought I was helping. But when the day came and he brought his bags through our door, I felt something else. Not dread, not quite. More like a shift, a quiet rearranging of air in the house. Suddenly, there was a new presence in our rooms, a shadow that carried both sorrow and something harder to define. I remember the way his suitcase bumped against the hallway wall, the way he hesitated in the doorway of the guest room like he wasn't sure if he belonged. I told him he did. I told him this was his home now. The days that followed were ordinary on the surface, as me cooking slightly larger dinners, folding an extra set of towels, listening to him talk about errands and bills that had once been his wife's domain. But underneath, I began to feel it, the weight of his eyes sometimes lingering longer than they should, the quiet gravity of his presence when I moved through the kitchen or the garden. He was grieving, I reminded myself. This was vulnerability, not intention. Still, there were moments, a hand brushing mine as he passed me a plate, a low murmur of thanks that sounded more like confession, that stayed with me longer than they should have. My husband didn't notice. Or maybe he chose not to. He was buried in work, his hours stretching later and later into the evening. He would come home, nod at his father across the table, eat quickly, and disappear into his office with his laptop still humming in his hands. And that left me and the man sitting across from me, quiet but watchful, carrying his sorrow like a coat he couldn't take off. I began to see things I hadn't seen before. The way he stirred his coffee, slow and deliberate. The way his shoulders filled the frame of the kitchen doorway. The way he looked at the photos of his wife, their edges frayed, the glass slightly dusty. There was one photo in particular, a beach trip from years ago. His hand rested on her shoulder in that picture, and every time he glanced at it, his mouth would tighten, almost imperceptibly. And then there was the smell. That faint trace of his cologne that lingered in the hallway after he walked through, subtle and old-fashioned, the kind of scent that stays in your memory long after you've left the room. I'd catch myself noticing it, holding my breath as if I could keep it there a moment longer. I told myself it was nothing. That this was compassion, nothing more. But one night, as I loaded the dishwasher and he stepped beside me to help, his hand brushed mine on the edge of a glass, and I felt a jolt, not of romance, not even of attraction, but of awareness. Awareness that he was there, that I was there, that something fragile and unspoken was hanging in the air between us. The house itself seemed to notice. The rooms felt different with him in them. The living room, once quiet and predictable, now held silences that felt heavier. The kitchen became a place of shared pauses and unfinished sentences. Even the garden felt altered, the chairs by the pool, the shadows stretching across the tiles in the late afternoon. I wondered if my husband felt it too. But if he did, he never said. I would catch myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying small, ordinary moments, a laugh at breakfast, the way he rested his hand on the back of a chair, the tired kindness in his voice when he asked if I needed help with anything. And in those moments, I felt something dangerous growing, not in him, not in me exactly, but in the space between us. I didn't know it then, but those first days set everything in motion. The kindness that brought him into our home became something else entirely, an opening, a shift, a slow, quiet turning of the ground beneath my feet. Even now, I can still picture that evening by the pool as if it's etched into the tiles themselves, the way the water reflected the last hints of sunlight, turning the surface into streaks of copper and shadow. He had been outside for a while before I joined him. I'd seen him from the kitchen window, sitting in one of the lounge chairs, his elbows resting on his knees, staring into the rippling water like it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. I hesitated, standing at the sink, my hands still wet from washing dishes, before I finally dried them and stepped outside. The air had that softness that only comes in the hour between day and night. The kind of air that feels like a pause, like the world is holding its breath. I carried 2 cups of tea with me, an excuse, really, though neither of us had asked for tea. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment, there was something in his eyes I couldn't name. Not joy, not sadness, but some quiet weight that made my chest tighten. I placed the tea on the small table between us, the steam rising in thin curls. He thanked me in that low voice of his, the kind of voice that sounds almost like it's being careful not to take up too much space. I sat down beside him, not too close, not too far. The silence was different from the silences inside the house. Out here, it felt thinner, easier to tear through. He started speaking first, his words halting, as if he hadn't meant to let them slip. He talked about the house he used to share with his wife, about how some mornings he still reached for her pillow before he remembered she wasn't there. He didn't cry, and he didn't need to, the way his hands curled around the cup, the way his voice dipped, said enough. I listened, nodding, saying little. But then, without even realizing it, I found myself talking too. I said things I hadn't planned to say, about how my marriage had turned into a rhythm so steady it sometimes felt like silence, about how I missed the small gestures, the unexpected moments. I didn't mean for my voice to sound so raw, but it did. We sat there, words drifting between us like leaves on water, and something shifted in that space. There wasn't a spark, not the kind you read about, nothing so obvious. It was subtler, heavier, like the realization that you've stepped past a line you didn't even see until your foot was already on the other side. He reached for his tea at the same moment I reached for mine, and our fingers brushed. It was barely anything, a brief touch, skin against skin for less than a heartbeat. But my pulse jumped. I looked up, and he was looking at me too, his brow slightly furrowed, like he was trying to read something on my face. For a moment, neither of us moved. And then we did. We kissed. I felt the world tilt just slightly, just enough to make me aware of every inch of myself, every inch of him, and the sheer impossibility of what we had just done. It wasn't a long kiss, it wasn't planned or perfect, but it existed now, and nothing would ever erase it. When we pulled away, the silence felt thicker. I stared at my hands, my breath uneven, my tea untouched. He looked toward the pool, his jaw tight, as though words were caught there but refused to come out. I thought about getting up, walking inside, pretending this hadn't happened. But my legs didn't move. The sky had darkened, the first stars faint above us, when I heard footsteps on the patio. My husband was coming outside. I snapped back into myself, moving my teacup, smoothing my hair, forcing my breath into something steady. His father shifted slightly in his seat, putting space between us in the most casual way he could manage. My husband didn't notice, or maybe he didn't want to. He glanced at us, at the cups on the table, at the quiet scene that must have looked perfectly ordinary. He asked how the tea was. I said it was good. My voice sounded normal. Inside, nothing felt normal. Later, when I went to bed, I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I told myself it was a mistake, a strange, fleeting mistake. But even as I repeated it, I knew that wasn't the truth. It hadn't felt like an accident. It had felt like a door quietly opening. And now I couldn't stop wondering what might happen if I stepped through. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed next to my husband, his even breathing filling the room while my mind replayed the moment by the pool on an endless loop. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt again that fleeting brush of lips, the weight of what it meant. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a slip, a moment born from grief and awkward comfort. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like the first crack in something solid, a hairline fracture you can't see until it spreads. By morning, the house was unnaturally quiet. My husband left early, mumbling something about a meeting, grabbing his keys and disappearing before I even finished my coffee. His absence left an emptiness that pressed against the walls. I moved through the day on autopilot, laundry, dishes, the dull routines that usually tether me to reality, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the night before. Every sound seemed louder. Every creak of the floorboards made me look up, half expecting him to appear in the doorway. By late evening, I heard the soft squeak of the sliding door. I glanced out and saw him again, sitting by the pool, his posture heavy, head tilted down. The same chair, the same water, the same quiet space between us that now felt charged. I told myself to stay inside. I told myself to leave it alone. But I didn't. I walked out barefoot, the tiles cool under my feet. He turned his head slightly when he heard me, not surprised, not startled. Just aware. Couldn't sleep? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head, the faintest movement. Too many thoughts, he murmured, his voice rough with fatigue. I sat down across from him. The air was cooler tonight, the water blacker, the smell of chlorine mingling with the night-blooming jasmine by the fence. We didn't speak for a while. There was nothing to fill the silence with but the faint hum of the filter and the occasional splash of water against the edges of the pool. Finally, he said, "It's strange. You live your whole life with someone and then, it's like the world just erases them overnight. But the space they took up," he paused, his hand gesturing vaguely toward the empty air. "It doesn't disappear. It just aches." I felt something twist in my chest. I nodded, because I couldn't think of anything better to do. And then I heard myself speaking again. Words I hadn't planned, words that came out too honest. I told him how sometimes I felt like a guest in my own marriage. How my husband and I were more like business partners than anything else these days, exchanging schedules and errands instead of affection. I hadn't meant to share that. But once the words started, I couldn't stop them. He looked at me, not pitying, not surprised, just listening in that deep, still way he has. There was something dangerous in that kind of listening. It made you want to say more. A plane passed overhead, its lights a thin streak across the night, and we both tilted our heads to watch it. I thought about all the places I'd never been, all the choices I'd never made, and the weight of every decision that had led me here. Our conversation drifted from heavy truths to lighter things, stories about his wife, about trips they'd taken, about the silly arguments they'd had over furniture and paint colors. He spoke softly, but his words painted her so vividly I almost felt like she was there beside us. When he went quiet, I realized I had been leaning forward, elbows on my knees, listening like a child to a bedtime story. I noticed the way the moonlight caught in his hair, the silver at his temples more pronounced than I'd ever really seen in the bright light of day. And then, suddenly, I noticed how close we were sitting. Not close enough to touch, but closer than before. A part of me wanted to stand up, break the spell, retreat back to the safety of walls and locked doors. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, my knees drawn up slightly, my fingers curling around the arm of the chair. Every now and then, his eyes met mine. Not long, not lingering, but long enough. The sound of water moving in the pool seemed louder, like the night itself was holding its breath. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I thought of my husband, asleep somewhere between exhaustion and indifference, and wondered what he would think if he saw me sitting there like that. But more than that, I wondered why I wasn't moving. We didn't kiss that night. But it felt like we might. And somehow, that felt even more dangerous. When I finally stood up, the chair scraping softly against the tiles, he didn't stop me. He just watched as I walked back inside, his face unreadable in the dim light. I closed the sliding door behind me and leaned against it, my hand flat against the cool glass. I could see his reflection in the window, still sitting, still silent, staring at the water. I went back to bed, my heart hammering, knowing something had shifted again. Not in a way anyone could see. But in a way I could feel. The trip wasn't planned. That was the first thing that made me uneasy about it. My husband announced it at breakfast one Thursday, his tone casual, almost offhand, as he reached for the orange juice. "We should get away for the weekend," he said, like he was suggesting a walk after dinner. "All of us." The words landed with a strange weight. All of us, meaning him, me, and his father. He didn't notice how I paused, how my fingers tightened around the handle of my mug. He just kept talking, about the old family house 2 hours away, about how it needed airing out, about how it might be good for his father to leave the city for a few days. I nodded, my voice even when I agreed, but inside I felt that flicker of panic. I didn't know what, exactly, I was afraid of, the idea of more time together, the closeness of shared walls, or the way my own pulse seemed to betray me every time I thought about it. By Friday afternoon, the three of us were in the car, the trunk packed with bags and grocery bags filled with food we probably wouldn't finish. My husband drove, one hand on the wheel, his phone buzzing every so often in the cup holder. His father sat beside him, quiet, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the city blurred into open fields and thin roads edged with trees. The silence in the car wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it had weight. My husband tried to fill it sometimes, with mentions of weather, roadwork, a story from work, but the words hung in the air and fell flat. His father would murmur something in response, a few words here and there, and then we would sink back into quiet. I watched his reflection in the rearview mirror more than I should have. I watched the way the light shifted across his face when the car passed under trees, the way his fingers flexed on his knee when the road turned. I told myself to stop, to look away, but my eyes kept drifting back. When we reached the house, the air smelled different, cleaner, sharper, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The house itself looked the same as it always had, 2 stories, paint a little chipped, shutters that creaked when you opened them. Inside, it felt almost frozen in time. The furniture was old but solid, the kind that belonged to someone's grandparents. There were photos on the walls, family reunions, birthdays, faces caught in frames of laughter and sunlight. I saw my husband as a boy in some of them, his father younger, smiling wider. We moved through the rooms, opening windows, brushing dust from shelves, letting in air that felt like it hadn't been inside in years. The first evening passed slowly. My husband cooked dinner, something simple, pasta and salad, and the 3 of us sat at the table, the creak of chairs and the clink of silverware sounding louder than normal. Conversation felt like it belonged to another house entirely. Here, there was only the sound of rain beginning to tap against the roof. By the time we cleared the dishes, the rain had grown heavier. It wasn't a storm, not yet, just that kind of steady, unrelenting rain that makes you feel like the world is shrinking into the walls around you. My husband disappeared into the small study after dinner, taking his laptop, already half absorbed in work before the door even clicked shut. That left me in the living room, gathering stray plates, the old rug soft under my bare feet. His father was there, too, in the armchair by the fireplace. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. The fire crackled, throwing shadows against the walls, the kind that made the room feel smaller, warmer, heavier. I sat on the sofa, the cushion dipping slightly beneath me, and for a while we just listened, to the rain, to the fire, to the distant sound of my husband's keyboard somewhere in the other room. Every so often, our eyes met. Not long enough to mean something, but long enough to make me think about it. I told myself to keep my mind still, to let the night pass like any other. But there was something about that house, about the way the rain blurred the windows, about the way the fire made the air feel closer, that made stillness impossible. At one point, I stood to add another log to the fire. He rose too, almost at the same moment, and for a second we were close, closer than I meant us to be, close enough to feel the warmth of his sleeve brushing mine. We stepped back, both of us quiet, the movement small but sharp enough to feel like it cut the air. The log fell into the flames, sparks jumping for a moment before settling into embers. I sat back down, and he returned to his chair. Neither of us spoke of that brief moment, but it stayed with me. Later, when I went to bed in the guest room with my husband already asleep, I stared at the ceiling, the sound of rain steady against the window. I thought about how the day had been ordinary. And how it hadn't been ordinary at all. And I wondered how much longer I could pretend those were the same thing. When we returned from the trip, everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The driveway, the front door, the familiar creak of the hallway floor, all of it should have grounded me, should have reminded me that life was still steady, still ordinary. But there was something under the surface now, a hum I couldn't turn off. The weekend had been uneventful in the eyes of anyone watching. We had cooked, we had tidied the house, we had sat by the fire while the rain pressed against the windows. There had been no overt lines crossed, no words that couldn't be taken back. And yet, the entire time, I had felt the edges of something sharp pressing closer and closer. At home, the rhythms of daily life tried to reassert themselves. My husband left early again on Monday, his phone buzzing as he muttered about deadlines, his briefcase already in his hand before I could ask if he'd have dinner at home. He kissed my cheek in the doorway the way you might pat a dog on the head before leaving, absent, distracted. It was almost a relief when the house fell silent again. Almost. Because now, silence wasn't just quiet. It was loaded. His father was outside when I found him that morning, standing near the garden beds. The sky was gray, the light flat, and he had his sleeves rolled up, pruning branches with a focus that seemed to hold the rest of the world away. I stepped out, a basket on my arm, pretending I needed herbs from the little patch near the fence. The truth was, I didn't need anything. I just didn't want to be inside, pacing like a trapped animal. He looked up when he heard me, his expression neutral, but his eyes not. We worked side by side for a while, cutting and trimming, the air filled with the smell of damp earth and rosemary. It should have been nothing. Two people in a garden, helping. But then his hand brushed mine when he reached for a branch I was holding steady. And it stayed there a second too long. The world felt very still. I looked up, and so did he. And for the second time, we kissed. There was no hesitation this time, no sense of accident. It was deliberate, quiet, inevitable. When we stepped back, I felt my breath catch in my throat. Not because of guilt, though it was there, simmering, but because of how easily it had happened. I turned away first, pretending to check the herbs in my basket, my hands shaking slightly though I tried to keep them steady. We didn't speak about it. We went back to clipping, to pulling stray weeds, to the ordinary motions of the morning. But it wasn't ordinary anymore. The rest of the day, I felt his presence like a hand on my back, guiding, pressing. Even when he wasn't in the room, he was. Inside, the house felt different. I would walk into the kitchen and catch the faint scent of his cologne and feel my stomach drop. I would hear his footsteps upstairs and freeze, wondering if he was coming down, if I should look busy, if I should look calm. When my husband came home that evening, he didn't notice, or maybe he didn't look closely enough. He kissed me again on the cheek, asked something about dinner, scrolled through emails at the table while eating. And I sat there across from him, my heart pounding, wondering how long I could keep this hidden. The second kiss wasn't just a kiss. It was a decision. Not spoken, not named, but there. And I didn't know yet what it meant. Only that I couldn't go back. The day after that second kiss, the air in the house felt heavy, as if every wall had learned to listen. I woke up before sunrise, my husband still asleep beside me, his arm draped across his chest in that way that looked like habit more than intimacy. I watched him for a long time, trying to remember what it used to feel like to lie beside him and feel safe. I wondered if he sensed the change in me, if he would have known just by looking. Downstairs, the morning passed in fragments. The sound of the coffee maker, the scrape of a chair, the smell of toast I forgot to eat. I caught a glimpse of his father through the kitchen window. He was outside again, moving slowly across the yard, checking the fence line like he always did. There was nothing extraordinary about it. And yet, I couldn't stop watching him. By noon, I felt like the walls were closing in. I needed to move, to do something, anything, that didn't involve the sound of my own breathing echoing in my ears. I told myself I'd go for a walk, maybe buy groceries we didn't actually need. But when I opened the front door, I nearly collided with the neighbor. She stood there holding a plate of cookies wrapped in foil, her raincoat still damp from the drizzle outside. She smiled, that polite, tight smile that neighbors have, and said she was just stopping by. Her eyes drifted past me, into the hallway, and then over my shoulder. Her gaze landed on him. He was in the living room, sitting on the edge of the sofa, leafing through yesterday's newspaper. He looked up, nodded a greeting. And the way her eyes lingered, just for a second too long, made my stomach twist. I don't know if she saw something or if she just sensed it, the way animals sense storms before they come. But when she handed me the plate, her fingers brushed mine and her expression changed ever so slightly. I thanked her, smiled, made small talk, but the unease stayed with me long after she left. That evening, I replayed that moment over and over, the way she had looked at me, the pause before she spoke. It was the first time I realized how thin the line was between what we were doing and being seen. Inside, the tension only grew sharper. We moved around each other like we were rehearsing some unspoken play. A hand brushing past in the kitchen, a glance that held too much, the weight of silence after a shared joke. I caught myself overthinking everything, How long we stood in the same room, how close I leaned when I handed him a dish towel, how my voice sounded when I said his name. The guilt sat in me like a stone, heavy but unmoving. My husband started asking more questions. Not the kind you could call confrontational, but the kind that scratched at the surface. Did you talk to Dad much today? Did he seem okay? What did you two get up to? I answered calmly, evenly, like there was nothing to hide. But I could hear it in his tone, the faintest shift, the hint that he was looking for something he couldn't quite name. And maybe he didn't even want to find it. That night, after the dishes were washed and the house fell quiet, I sat in the living room with the TV on, the volume low, more for noise than for anything else. He walked in. We didn't speak. He sat on the other end of the sofa, the distance between us barely enough to matter. For a while, we just watched the flickering images on the screen, both pretending to care about the muted dialogue neither of us was really hearing. And then he leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and the space between us changed. I felt the air shift, felt my pulse quicken, felt that familiar, dangerous awareness. Neither of us moved closer. But neither of us moved away. When I finally stood, turning off the TV, I told myself it was just to break the moment, to put an end to the tension that was growing unbearable. But as I walked past him, I could feel his eyes following me. The house felt different again that night. Not louder. Just heavier. Like every room was holding its breath. The storm came without warning that night, the kind of rain that doesn't tap politely but pounds, the kind that makes the windows shiver and turns the sky into one long flash of gray. By the time the power went out, the whole house had sunk into that strange, hollow silence that only comes when electricity dies. No hum from the refrigerator, no flick of light from the hallway lamp, just the storm outside and the darkness swallowing everything else. My husband had been called out earlier that evening. Some emergency at work, some crisis he didn't explain in detail, just a rushed explanation as he grabbed his keys and disappeared into the rain. The moment the door closed behind him, the air in the house shifted again. I lit a candle in the kitchen, the flame trembling against the drafts sneaking through the old window frames. The shadows it threw stretched long across the counters and walls. I could hear him moving somewhere upstairs, the sound of footsteps slow and measured. When he came down, the light caught him in fragments, his hand on the banister, the faint sheen of rain on his sleeve, the deep creases in his forehead softened by the dim glow. "Power's out?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," I said quietly, setting the candle on the table. There was a pause between us, filled only by the sound of the storm battering the roof. We ended up in the living room, another candle lit on the coffee table, the two of us sitting across from each other in the kind of half-dark that makes everything feel closer. The walls seemed to lean in, the shadows felt heavier, and the silence stretched so far it almost felt like it could break. I tried to busy myself, folding a stray blanket, straightening a stack of magazines that didn't need straightening, but every movement felt obvious, like I was drawing attention to my own unease. He sat there, hands clasped loosely in his lap, watching me with that calm, steady gaze that always seemed to strip away the layers I tried to keep in place. The storm cracked outside, a roll of thunder so deep it felt like it passed through the floorboards, through me. I don't know who moved first. Maybe neither of us did. Maybe it was simply the storm, the darkness, the fact that we were alone in a house that felt smaller by the minute. But somehow, there was no distance left between us. And that night, we spent the night together. The hours blurred into one long stretch of time I couldn't measure. The storm outside rose and fell, the wind shook the branches against the house, but inside, there was only that single, undeniable truth of what we'd done. By dawn, the rain had eased, and the faint light of morning crept through the windows. The candles had burned low, the air still heavy with the scent of melted wax and something else I couldn't name. I sat on the edge of the sofa, staring at the floor, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. He sat nearby, silent. There was no need for words. What we had crossed couldn't be undone, couldn't be wrapped in excuses or made small enough to ignore. The storm had passed, but it had left something behind. Something I couldn't sweep away. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady. The room looked the same as it had yesterday, the same furniture, the same walls, but it wasn't the same anymore. Nothing was. The morning after the storm felt like waking into someone else's life. The light was soft and pale, slipping through the blinds in streaks, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like exposure. Like everything that had been swallowed by the night was now sitting in the daylight, waiting to be named. I moved slowly, careful with every step, as though the floor itself might betray me. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't calm but heavy, full of unsaid things. My husband's car wasn't back yet, the driveway was still empty, the rainwater pooling in shallow puddles that reflected the gray sky. Downstairs, I found him sitting at the kitchen table. He wasn't reading, wasn't drinking coffee, he was just sitting there, hands clasped, staring at nothing in particular. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his hair still damp from where the storm had pressed against him the night before. I didn't say good morning. Neither did he. I moved past him, setting a mug under the coffee machine like it was any other day. The clink of ceramic against metal sounded too loud. He didn't look at me, but I could feel him there, the space between us alive with the memory of what we'd done. I poured coffee for him too, though I didn't ask if he wanted it. I set the mug down in front of him, and for a moment our hands almost touched. Almost. When he murmured thank you, it was soft, almost reflexive, but it cut through the room like a knife. I sat across from him. The chairs creaked. The coffee steamed. We didn't speak. And yet, we were both speaking in the silence. I couldn't stop looking at his hands. The way his fingers wrapped around the mug, steady now, but not quite relaxed. I wondered if his mind was running as fast as mine, if he was replaying every second of the night before, if he was already thinking about the weight of what it meant. When my husband finally returned late that morning, the entire house seemed to tense. I heard his car before I saw it, the crunch of tires on wet gravel, the slam of the door. He walked in, shaking water from his jacket, dropping his keys on the counter with a clatter. He kissed me on the cheek, distracted, talking about the storm and the chaos at work. I nodded in all the right places, but my heartbeat was too loud in my ears. He didn't notice the way I gripped the edge of the counter, didn't notice the way his father's eyes stayed fixed on his coffee mug instead of meeting his son's gaze. The day passed in fragments, phone calls for my husband, errands he insisted he had to run, tasks that gave me room to breathe, but not really. Every glance felt like it carried a question. Every movement felt deliberate, like we were all aware of being watched, even when no one was watching. In the afternoon, I went outside to hang towels in the weak sunlight. The air smelled clean after the rain, the grass still slick beneath my feet. He stepped out too, carrying something for the shed. We didn't speak. But we looked at each other, just for a moment. And I felt it again, that pull, that sharp ache of wanting something I couldn't have, of knowing that I'd already taken it and couldn't return it. When evening came, the weight in the house hadn't lifted. It was worse, if anything. My husband sat with his laptop in the living room, the glow of the screen reflecting on his face. He looked tired, but not suspicious. Or maybe I just told myself that. I cooked dinner, moving carefully, my hands steady even as my mind spun. His father helped set the table, his movements quiet, precise. Our eyes didn't meet, but our awareness of each other filled every gap in conversation, every pause between my husband's words. After dinner, we cleared the dishes in silence, each of us trapped in our own thoughts. Later that night, when the house was finally dark, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My husband's breathing beside me was slow and even. I thought about the storm. I thought about the night. I thought about what we'd done and what it had already started to undo. And I knew, with a clarity that hurt, that there was no way to go back to who I had been before the rain fell. It was the way the day unfolded that should have warned me. There was nothing extraordinary about it, no storms, no long silences, no interruptions to the rhythm of our lives. And yet every hour seemed to bend toward something I couldn't see but could feel coming. The morning began like so many others. My husband sat at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand, half listening as I listed groceries we needed. His father was already outside, moving slowly across the yard, checking the garden beds, the same routine he always kept. The sunlight was sharp that day, cutting through the windows in white bars, making every surface look too clean, too honest. I couldn't stop glancing at the clock, even though I didn't know what I was waiting for. By afternoon, the house felt restless. My husband had left for an errand, something vague, an appointment he didn't explain. I told myself it would be like all the other afternoons, quiet, predictable, harmless. I stepped outside to water the plants on the porch. He was there, leaning against the railing, the sun hitting his face in that way that made the silver in his hair brighter. He looked up when he heard me, and for a moment, we just stood there, the distance between us too short for comfort. There was a familiarity now, a weight in every glance, every movement. I turned away first, focusing on the watering can in my hands, but my pulse betrayed me, racing too fast for something so ordinary. By evening, my husband returned earlier than I expected. I heard the car before I saw it, the gravel crunching under the tires, the low hum of the engine cutting off. I froze for a second, the kind of pause that feels endless but is over in an instant. When he walked into the house, there was something about his face that unsettled me, not suspicion, not anger, but an alertness I hadn't seen before. He moved through the hallway, his footsteps even, his voice calm when he asked, "Is Dad around?" I swallowed the urge to answer too quickly, too casually. "He's on the porch," I said, my voice level. He nodded and walked toward the door, and I felt my chest tighten, though I couldn't explain why. I followed him out, the screen door creaking as we stepped onto the veranda. And there he was, leaning close to me, just close enough that anyone could see too much. We kissed. I felt the world stop for one brief, impossible second. Then I saw him, my husband, standing there, his hands still on the doorframe, his eyes fixed on us. The air between us shattered. The silence was louder than any scream could have been. My husband didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His face was a map of everything he didn't yet understand but already knew. I stepped back, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat, the taste of panic sharp in my mouth. His father didn't move. He just stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with something I couldn't read. The three of us stayed like that for what felt like forever, the quiet stretching, thick and unbearable. No one spoke first. No one had to. Because in that one frozen moment, every truth that had been hidden, every secret, every line we had crossed, was laid bare. And there was no one doing any of it. The house didn't sound the same after that moment on the veranda. It wasn't just silence, it was the kind of quiet that seemed to stick to your skin, the kind you could hear in your own bones. No one raised their voice, no one shouted accusations across the table, but something heavier had moved in, and it wasn't leaving. I don't remember what I did first. Maybe I stepped back inside. Maybe I stayed there for a moment too long, hands shaking against my sides, before moving anywhere at all. What I do remember is the look in my husband's eyes, steady, unblinking, as if he wasn't sure which version of the truth to believe. He didn't ask questions. That was the strangest part. There were no demands, no why, no how long, no what does this mean. Instead, he walked past me into the kitchen, set his keys on the counter, and leaned against the sink. I stood in the doorway, unable to move closer, unable to leave. His father followed me, and after a long pause, his face unreadable, his steps slower than usual. There were 3 of us in that room, and every second felt like glass underfoot, thin, fragile, ready to break. I made dinner that night. I don't even remember what I cooked. I know there were vegetables on the counter, a knife in my hand, the rhythm of slicing almost mechanical. I remember the sound of running water as I rinsed something in the sink, the way the faucet hissed too loud in the silence. They sat at the table like they always did, but nothing about it was normal. Every scrape of a fork on a plate sounded like an argument that hadn't been spoken. Every glance across the table carried the weight of what had been seen. We didn't talk about the veranda. We didn't talk about what had been broken. But we all knew. Later that evening, my husband went upstairs early. He didn't look angry, not in the way people imagine anger, no slammed doors, no harsh words, but there was a quietness in his movements that felt colder than rage could ever be. His father stayed downstairs for a while, sitting in the same chair by the window, staring out at the darkened yard. He didn't look at me, and I didn't look at him. I washed the dishes alone, the warm water stinging my hands, though I didn't turn the tap too hot. It felt like penance, though I couldn't have said for what, exactly what I'd done, what I hadn't done, what I couldn't undo. The hours stretched. At one point, I heard the sound of a suitcase being dragged across the floor upstairs. The muffled thud of a closet door. The slow creak of the stairs as someone came down. He didn't announce he was leaving. He didn't sit us down and explain. His father just appeared in the hallway with a small bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't look at me when he walked to the door. I didn't stop him. The door closed softly behind him, and the house seemed to exhale, though the air it left behind was thick and bitter. I stood in the kitchen long after he left, staring at the place where his mug had sat on the table that morning. Upstairs, my husband's footsteps moved from one room to another, steady and deliberate. He didn't come down again that night. I went to bed late, lying on my back with my hands folded on my stomach, staring at the ceiling as if the plaster might give me answers. The house felt emptier, but not lighter. Everything was still there, the memories, the choices, the moment on the veranda that couldn't be taken back. I thought about the beginning, about the day I'd told myself we were only helping him by inviting him in. I thought about how kindness had turned into something else entirely. And as I lay there, I realized there would never be a moment when it all ended. No clear line between before and after. There was only the weight of what had happened, and the silence that would never sound like peace again.